You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, coming to you from Maryland.
Hey, Katie. Good to be back with you. How are you doing?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great. And I'm especially glad that on our second podcast for 2023, we're joined by a familiar voice on this show. I'm very pleased, of course, to welcome back Sebastian Strangio, the Diplomat's Southeast Asia editor. Sebastian, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. How are you guys doing?
Doing quite well. And Sebastian, of course, I'm particularly pleased to have you on because we got a few queries from our listeners to talk a little bit about what's been happening over the last few weeks in Vietnam, where we've seen a very interesting start to the year politically with a fairly remarkable leadership shuffle. Some are calling it a purge. First two deputy prime ministers spreading to the president. Tell us a little bit about what exactly has happened in Vietnam and why we're seeing this at the moment. What does this tell us about the nature of politics at the highest levels of the Vietnamese state and the Communist Party of Vietnam's broader approach to internal affairs in this moment?
What we're seeing right now, I think, is the culmination of a nearly decade-long anti-corruption, I guess you would say, campaign that has been probably the signature policy of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Nguyen Phu Trong. Trong is now in his third term. He's been in the position for more than a decade now. And since the sort of middle of the 2010s, he set his sights on ridding the Communist Party of Vietnam of corruption. This has become a huge issue as Vietnam's economy has grown. And we've seen, this intensify gradually and reach, incandescent levels over the course of 2022. I think one of the problems is that despite all this anti-corruption efforts, there's still been a huge amount of corruption scandals that have been incredibly embarrassing to the party. Two particular ones, which are connected to the recent expulsions and resignations, were related to the country's COVID-19 effort. One of them had to do with scandal involving overpriced test kits for COVID-19, and another one had to do with essentially bribing Vietnamese citizens to gain seats on repatriation flights at the height of the pandemic. And both of these scandals have implicated not just the two deputy prime ministers and the president, which you mentioned before, but also a host of senior officials in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and senior government and party officials across the spectrum. And so, what we're really seeing now is a reassertion of the prerogative of the Communist Party itself as over the government. That seems to be the most seems to make the most sense. That you've got these officials that have done quite well, including the former foreign minister Pham Binh Minh, and of course the president Nguyen Xuan Phuc. Phuc, of course, was also prime minister for 5 years to 2021. Both of these officials were very visible internationally, and they had a good reputation as government officials, as civil servants who represented Vietnam on the global stage. But I think what we're seeing is, because of the corruption, because of all these issues that have challenged the moral and political legitimacy of the Vietnamese Communist Party, we've seen the party itself sort of reassert its control, and we've seen sort of the rising prominence of the security sort of apparatus within the party, which I think is, seeking to reestablish, a sort of a norm of good behavior, I suppose, and to take back power from these government officials, which they view as having corrupted the image of the party in the eyes of the Vietnamese people.
We often discuss Vietnam in geopolitical terms as kind of sandwiched between China and the U.S., and there's a lot of sort of criminology in reading of the movements for that geopolitical angle. So, I'm gonna ask kind of an obvious question for this podcast: is there a geopolitical dimension to this leadership change, or is this really strictly a domestic issue and sort of has more to do with the internal dynamics of the party and the state and the relationship with the people than any external factors?
It's not likely to have much of an impact on Vietnam's external relations. I think for two reasons. One is that Vietnam's foreign policy over the past, really since normalization with China in the early 90s, has been pretty consistent. I think it's conditioned very strongly by proximity to China and the need, the centrality that China, the central role that China plays in Vietnamese foreign policy. So I think, the geographic proximity of China it imposes one great restraint. It narrows the band of potential options for the Vietnamese government in terms of its international alignments. Obviously, in the 1980s, it allied against China with the Soviet Union, and it was, it basically endured a decade plus of a state of war essentially with China, and that helped to hobbled its economic recovery from the war, and so forth, so on and so forth. And so I think that that will ensure a certain amount of continuity. The second factor has to do with how foreign policy is made in Vietnam, which is, the Politburo makes decisions, sets the country's foreign policy as a collective. Individuals within the Politburo can be more or less influential in that process, but this is not something that relies on any single individual. And there's no indication that we're likely to see a significant shift in Vietnam's foreign policy, over the months to come. There is a tendency in the West to sort of identify a Western-leaning faction and a pro-China faction within the Communist Party, but I think that's vastly oversimplistic. You have the existence of rivalries and I suppose you might call them factions within the CPV, but they're very they reflect a lot of different other things, including patronage networks. They reflect regions of origin within Vietnam, regional power bases within the country, and personal loyalties of various sorts. Obviously, foreign policy and views of engagement with the West and exactly the pace at which that should proceed is part of that, but it's a relatively small part, I think. And there's no evidence that this recent orientation, or rather move against, all of these individuals within the party and government was motivated by foreign policy. I think it is probably worth saying, though, that while Vietnam's foreign policy will remain consistent, there is the likelihood that, the loss of so many officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including Min, who was, he served for a decade as Vietnam's foreign minister and was, involved on the Politburo with setting foreign policy and dealing with external relations. The loss of these officials could lead to a sort of human resources shortfall and the a loss of talent. And so the implementation of Vietnam's foreign policy and the balancing act that it attempts could be complicated and made more difficult by this. But, we'll have to wait and see.
So actually, just following up on that point, Sebastian, a related question I have is actually about Vietnam's economic role in Asia, right? Vietnam has been somewhat rare in maintaining its economic dynamism, the economic dynamism it exhibited pre-COVID through the first year of COVID and even through last year when Vietnam grew at about 8%. And of course, I don't want to oversimplify things, but one of the factors that I think has led to confidence among investors, companies setting up manufacturing plants in Vietnam is the relatively predictable politics and the relatively predictable and stable leadership. If you had to sort of maybe project forward into, the next few months and maybe longer term, depending on how long this sort of high-level party tumult lasts, do you think this political shuffle that's remarkable by everything I guess we've seen over from Vietnamese politics over the last couple of decades, do you think that'll have sort of any blowback or consequences for how Vietnam is perceived economically in the region and even globally?
Like you say, it depends on how far this all goes, but I do think that the impact is probably likely to be fairly minimal. I'm not an economist, and there are potentially other issues with the Vietnamese economy that could weigh into this equation. But if we're talking purely about the question of political instability, I think in some ways, this shows the strength of the Communist Party, and it sort of indicates a strengthening of the political controls. Now, one potential impact that has been discussed is the chilling effect that the anti-corruption campaign has actually had on lower levels of Vietnamese bureaucracy, where people are scared to make any decisions at all because of the fear of getting, trapped, and prosecuted for something. And corruption has probably helped to grease Vietnam's economic development over the last couple of decades. This is, as some scholars have argued, it has done in the case of China, that corruption has worked sort of in favor of economic growth to a certain extent during early phases of development. And so, we're seeing, Reuters, I think, wrote an interesting report on this about the impacts that the anti-corruption campaign is having on the functioning of the Vietnamese state. And so that could potentially be an issue. But I think, a lot of what's driving positive Western perceptions of Vietnam, to bring it back to geopolitics, is that Vietnam offers a lot of the things that once made China attractive as a destination for foreign investment: a fairly skilled workforce, but still, low cost workforce. And the fact that there are now geopolitical concerns about investment in China for some firms in the West, Vietnam has emerged as a very attractive alternative. And I don't see that the attraction fading anytime soon. Now, it could, if things get, if instability becomes the norm in Vietnamese politics, then that could flow through to the economy. But I don't think we're quite at that stage yet.
So I wanted to sort of call back to something you said in the first sort of set of remarks that you made about the motivation of the party behind this leadership purge. How is this being perceived by the people in Vietnam? If the idea behind this is the party demonstrating to the public that we do take this anti-corruption drive seriously, how has this been perceived both within Vietnam by citizens, and then maybe also how is this being perceived by neighboring countries? Would be something interesting worth hearing.
It's a hard question to answer because I'm not, I don't really have my finger on the pulse of public opinion in Vietnam. But from what I've heard from other analysts who have done work on this, that, it's been a fairly broadly popular thing. I mean, I think public distaste for the high living of senior government and party officials has been rising for many years now. And especially the revelations that government officials were taking advantage of the pandemic to enrich themselves and line their own nests, I think has been, really threatens to undermine not just the political legitimacy of the Communist Party, but its moral legitimacy, as sort of a bastion of ethical, the sort of Confucian values, I suppose. And this is something that I think a lot of ordinary people are probably happy to see. Now, anyone who's informed about Vietnamese politics would also be aware that, that this is, always to a certain extent selective. I mean, the the public security minister is one of the favorites of candidates to take over the president's role following Phuk's resignation. To Lam. And he, is somebody who was caught on video last year dining on a gold-encrusted steak at a London restaurant. And, a video that went viral on Vietnamese social media and created a lot of a stir. But he has not yet fallen victim to the anti-corruption movement. So I think there's probably an awareness amongst the people that this is all politically filtered and that there are individuals that are still probably beyond the reach of this campaign. But I think broadly, people were probably pretty satisfied to see some of these officials brought low. As for neighboring countries, I don't, it's hard to say how this would be viewed. I think they probably it's mostly viewed in the halls of government in Southeast Asian countries as an internal Vietnamese affair that, I think that a lot of people would probably, in some other governments would probably admire the ability of the Communist Party to mount a purge on this scale and to take down such senior officials. If you look at countries like, the Philippines or Indonesia, which are so decentralized and where corruption is, rife at all levels of government, there'd probably be, a frustration on the part of some technocrats that they don't have the sort of cohesive top-down political control necessary to attempt something like this. But it is kind of a remarkable, by Southeast Asian standards, it is, quite an unusual thing. And I think you really do need a very hierarchically organized party state in order to attempt something like this. And even in the Vietnamese case, there's indication that it's not really working in many ways. The fact that it's been dragging on for so many years and that there's still more corruption scandals emerging, just points to the challenge of doing this.
Well, Sebastian, I was going to ask you a bit about Tolam, but you already addressed that in your answer to Katie's question. Just very quickly on Tolam sort of being the Minister of Public Security and speculated to be first in line for the presidency, as many commentators suggest. Do you think that his sort of bureaucratic background as sort of Minister of Public Security could lead to this purge sort of becoming amplified, Tolam sort of taking on some of his perceived rivals or opponents? Is there a concern there over the long term?
It's hard to say. It's very opaque, but I think it does indicate the prominence of the public security ministry now within the new constellations of power in Vietnam. The prime minister as well, the current prime minister, Pham Minh Chinh, he is also a denizen, as far as I'm aware, of the public security ministry. And so I think we're seeing, this is sort of like, it almost seems like the attack dog of the Communist Party is the controls the organs of the state, the organs of state security, and is able to, and so if that involves overlooking some issues with some of the officials in this ministry, such as Tolam, who embarrassed the party going out and spending $1,000 on a steak, that might be sort of the price of it. But from what I understand, we're likely to see increased prominence of officials from the security forces, these organs of state, once this leadership reshuffle, this purge, has played out.
Great. Well, Katie, did you have any final questions?
Nope. Just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us, Sebastian. It's always nice to see you and hear from you.
Likewise.
You too, guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks a lot. This was fun.
Absolutely. It's always fun to talk Southeast Asia with you, Sebastian. Thanks for joining us. For listeners, make sure you subscribe so you can, of course, keep up with future episodes of the podcast. Like I said, this podcast was a result of some listener demand. So as always, we do take that into account. So don't feel like you can't reach out to either me or Katie with suggestions for episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. You can do that anywhere you get your podcast. We really appreciate it. And we do take that feedback seriously. Thanks for listening. And Katie and I will be back soon with more.